Color re-enters Cubism around 1912, and this is a great example of it. This is a painting called The Scallop Shell. Our future is in the air. And as Mr. Lauder has said repeatedly, so I don't think I'm out of school telling the story, he was auditing a class that Kirk Varnedoe was teaching at the Institute of Fine Arts. It was a class on Cubism, and Mr. Lauder was in the back of the room, and Kirk Varnedoe was saying, there is one picture that bridges analytic cubism with its more monochromatic, fractured forms and the colorful shapes, flat shapes of synthetic cubism, and that is, dun, 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 he hit next slide, and this went on. And Mr. Lauder said all he could think was, oh my God, it's hanging in my living room. And for him, that was a moment to sort of reassess his collection. He had been buying things that he liked and that he found were interesting, and he realized they were important as well, and that if he applied a rigor to himself as a collector, that he could create a very important collection. And he began opening his home to scholars and to classes who wanted to see his works of art. This picture was a very early purchase for him. You see, it's on an oval canvas. It could be because Picasso didn't like corners. I don't think so. Chris Poggi, who is a professor at Penn, has talked about it. It's a still life, right? And what shape are cafe tables often in Paris? They're often round, but we don't see them as circles unless we're hovering above them. We see them with perspective, so they become oval. So it's a still life on a table, and the shape of the canvas actually doubles as the top of the table. And you see at left part of a newspaper masthead, journal, but it's also jouer, to play, because the cubists, for the cubists, this kind of visual creation was a game, not to say that it wasn't serious, but there was a playfulness to it for them. You see a glass right in the middle of the composition, and then on the far right, you see now the advent of bright color. Notre avenir est dans l'air, our future is in the air. This is a fairly realistic interpretation of a pamphlet that was produced by the Michelin Tire Company to promote aviation. And Picasso and Braque loved airplanes. They called each other Wilbur and Orville as nicknames, and they felt that what they were doing had just as much promise. Cubism was a movement that is very much a pre-war movement. There's none of the horror of the war in it. Anything was possible, and it was okay to challenge everything. Not only is he challenging with his subject matter, but he's challenging once again what materials are okay to use, because this bright color is not oil paint. It's enamel, industrial grade enamel paint by the Ripollin Company. And this is a postcard that has long been in Leonard Lauder's collection. And I love it because it let me know that I have always mispronounced this paint. And there's a little limerick underneath. I'm bound to be, let's see if I can read this. I'm bound to be a genius, said little Johnny Green. I've discovered the best paint. Its name is Ripollin. Picasso introduces color in many different ways, through the Ripollin paint, but also through colorful dots. Certainly, he was seeing works by artists like Seurat and Cross and others in Paris at this time. This is a Seurat that is the Circus Sideshow in the Metz collection. Here's a detail of it. And while the dots might remind you of the pointillism of Seurat, Picasso was not at all interested in that kind of scientific color theory that is absolutely integral to understanding what Seurat was doing. This idea that juxtaposed bits of color would combine in the viewer's eye to create a certain kind of vibrancy. If you look at Picasso's painting, he has areas of just one color at a time. So there's something else going on here as well. And I think it's his interest always throughout his life in both high and low cultures, in street cultures. Here you can see Toulouse-Lautrec's lithograph for confetti. It turns out that paper confetti didn't really hit Paris until 1892. There was a holiday back then that no longer exists called Mi-Carême, Mid-Lent. And it sounds sort of obnoxious when I say this, but this is how people wrote about it at the time, that Lent was simply too long if you were French, that it was just impossible to go that entire period without having a break. And so this holiday, Mi-Carême, Mid-Lent, was literally 24 hours right in the middle where everyone cut loose. And the closest analogy I can give you is Mardi Gras down in New Orleans. There were parades, there was confetti, as you can see in this postcard. And the people who celebrated the most and were often arrested the most were the students, identified by their falouche, which is that hat, because they took this carnival and the parade very seriously. You can see in this picture by Picasso of a student, here he has got the spotted face, and he's holding what we recognize as a bottle of alcohol in the crook of his arm, and his face just happens to be red, which tends to be a sign of inebriation, and he's reading a newspaper. Now, Picasso often abbreviates the newspaper's journal as jus, which we saw before, but here he's abbreviated as urinal, and John Richardson was not the first person to point out that urinal is the same word in French as it is in English. And it just so happens that that year that this was created, more than 300 students were arrested for drunken, lascivious behavior, which I believe means that they were urinating in the streets. The parade passed a half a block from Picasso's studio, and the place where you would enjoy these parades, according to all the published sources, were the cafes that lined the grand boulevards. And the cafes had special mats, actually made out of asbestos, if you can believe it, that they would give to their clients, and you would put on top of your wine glasses or your beers or your glasses of absinthe so that the confetti didn't get in. And I think that is what Picasso was actually thinking about when he painted Mr. Lauder's cast of the absinthe glass. This is one of 6 sculptures that were cast by Kahnweiler in bronze. So it's a cast glass, a cast sugar cube, and a real absinthe spoon. Now, the way absinthe was enjoyed, it was an incredibly popular drink at the time, is you would put the sugar cube on top of that slotted spoon, pour water over it slowly, which would dissolve the sugar, and then dilute this very strong alcohol down below. The wine industry, it's a whole long story, but the wine industry wanted absinthe gone because it was cutting into their profit margin. And so there was a huge campaign to get rid of absinthe, and it was said to be a hallucinogenic, which it never was. It was just very, very strong alcohol. And so this is another postcard that just happens to be in Mr. Lauder's collection about the green peril, because absinthe is a green-colored liqueur. And just to go back, so by 1914, when this sculpture was made and painted and completed, I think that any of Picasso's peers or colleagues, anyone who saw this, would instantly think it was very much of the time, absinthe being one of the most popular drinks around, and these mi-carême festivals with confetti everywhere. But by the following year, 1915, it was completely obsolete. The wine lobbies had succeeded in getting absinthe banned, and then paper confetti was banned as well because of paper shortages due to World War I. Braque used dots in many different ways as well. Here is his still life bottle of rum from 1914, and I'm showing it to you in part so you can notice that there's one piece of paper collaged on there. There's a little sticker with the number 19 on it. This was not something that Braque put on. This was something that was put on much later. Kahnweiler, this very important dealer of Cubism, he was in Italy when when France entered World War I. He had to spend the war in Switzerland. He was not welcome there as a German national. And even though he continued to pay rent on his little shop, all of his things were sequestered. They were seized by the French government, as was the property of all Germans living in France. And these things were sold in the early 20s to help pay off France's war debt. And Kahnweiler lost all of his pictures. They were sold in 4 sales in the early 20s, and each one of them had a sticker like this that matched the auction catalogs. 19 is the lot number.